In days gone by, if you suffer from a migraine, someone might recommend that you bind a plantain to your head with red thread. Did this work? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you are well on this fine August day. We were supposed to have a heat wave in the UK, and yesterday in London it was about 36 degrees centigrade and in Newcastle it was about 23. So I do actually think we possibly got the better end of the deal in that one. I am going to jump straight into this week's episode because it is going to be a long one, and we're going to be looking at Old English medicine and magical remedies because we are doing medicine and so on this week. And just as a little preview of next week's episode, we're actually going to be having a look at the folklore of teeth and dentistry. So if you've got any kind of teeth issues or anything like that, perhaps you might prefer the one after that, which is Black Death folklore. So just to let you know what's coming up. And then we've also got another episode for the very end of August, which I'm torn between two different things. So it's either going to be on the doctrine of signatures or it's going to be on the folklore of sleep. So if you've got a preference, please do let me know. Either send me a message on Instagram, Twitter, email, whatever you want to get hold of me really. And I'll pick whichever one has the most votes. Now on to Old English medicine. When we examine the history of medicine, which I did actually study at school by the way, and it's fascinating, there can be a tendency to focus on the classical theories of doctors like Hippocrates and Galen. And Galen, we should remember, thought that the body actually made blood in the liver and then it was just consumed by the body as it moved around and dissipated into all of the tissues and so on. But this isn't the kind of stuff that you'd necessarily find ordinary people or local healers relying on. And there are documents in the British Library that lay bare the foundations of Anglo-Saxon medicine, and these remedies are essentially a mixture of charms, classic medical practice, folklore and magic. And this earlier medical practice also relies far less on costly astrology or treatments related to the four humours than later medieval medicine did. Now, Julian Walker points out that some of the remedies do sound strange to our ears, but there are also a lot of remedies in these various texts that actually make a lot of sense, and as we will learn, some of them absolutely still work. And it is these remedies, cures and treatments used by healers and ordinary folk alike that we're going to be having a look at today. And the only reason why we know how our ancestors dealt with medicine and health is through Old English medical texts. And the British Library holds some of the surviving Old English books, referred to as Bald's Leech Book, Leech Book 3 and the Lachnunga. I should point out that Leech Book, I was like, oh my god, is that to do with leeches, which are one of the few things on the planet which really freak me out. But no, it's actually another word for healing. And Bald ordered the compilation of the Leech Book texts at around about 900 or so. And Sinead Spearing notes that the copies that exist today are actually copies of a 6th century manuscript. And she also says that these earlier versions were compendiums of earlier work again, so it's hard to tell exactly how old many of these remedies are. And the third collection of the Leech Book runs closer to magical or supernatural remedies. And when I say that, I don't mean they're supernatural remedies, they're remedies for supernatural things, if that makes sense. And Julian Walker notes that Bald's Leech Book also contains some Mediterranean medicine, which does demonstrate the sharing of, and perhaps trading of, medicinal knowledge during the period. Largely, Volume 1 deals with external problems, Volume 2 focuses on the internal complaints, and it's the third one, as I say, plus the Lachnunga, which are more of the invocations and magical charms and so on, that will ward off these magical ailments. Now, the Lachnunga actually dates to the late 10th, early 11th century, and it's written in a combination of Old English, Old Irish and Latin, and you can actually view it on the British Library website if you want to have a look. And you'll find the link to that in my blog post, which is in the show notes below. There is some debate as to where the Lachnunga comes from. Some people think it might be Northumbria and other people think it might be Winchester. So what did people actually believe caused illness? Put simply, they didn't always know. But they did believe in a shadowy other world, described by Spearing as, and I quote, a realm of powerful supernatural forces recognised as tangible beings responsible for illness and disease, end quote. Now, these beings are usually referred to as elves, but nightwalkers, aka vampires, spirits and hags also get a mention in the texts, among others. And these spirits could cause illness or disease among humans from their place within the other world, and elves in particular were blamed for causing a whole range of medical conditions, with the term elf shot referring to this idea. Part of this concept was supported by the discovery of Mesolithic flints and other stone arrowheads. So the idea is that an elf in the other world then shoots you and you end up with an ailment as a result. It often referred to things like arthritis or rheumatism, or those weird stabbing pains that you get for no real reason. It was usually those kind of things. And the late Eric W. Edwards actually wrote that the belief in elf shot was still common in Scotland and Northern England as late as the 18th century. Now, while the belief was particularly common around horses and cattle, humans could also suffer, and doctors would be unable to find any physical evidence of an elf shot wound, which apparently this demonstrated the skill of the elf marksman, but rather we would understand it as the physical manifestation of an internal malady. Now, Alaric Hall actually notes the famous case of Bessie Dunlop during the Scottish witch trials, and she had explained that she was working alongside Tom Reid, and he was the ghost of somebody that she'd known who was actually working for the Queen of Elfame, otherwise known as the Queen of Fairyland. And in her confession, Dunlop explains that if people had been elf gripped, she would then ask Tom how to help them, and he would be able to pass on a remedy, obviously being in Elfame himself. Hall does further explore the etymological significance of the word grippet, but he concludes that the effect was much the same. People thought they'd been afflicted by fairies. Now, Hall does take issue with some of the discussions of elf shot, believing instead that the Old English word ofscotten has been mistranslated, but the underlying belief in supernatural causes of ailments does persist, and Karen Louise Jolly then explains how the medical attack by elves was eventually linked with Christian ideas of demons. And this is a really important thing to bear in mind with these texts, that they emerge from a period in which the Anglo-Saxon culture is then mixing with early Christianity. And while you would normally think these two societies would be completely at loggerheads, the Remedies do show a fusion of the two worldviews. The medical work lies in this liminal space between magic and religion. So remedies frequently include prayers, and they include Latin, and then you've got these pagan concoctions, but then there's also a degree of liturgy in there as well. And as Jolly points out, most people sort of see this conversion from the Saxon pagan religion to Christianity as this massive dramatic event that's like this proper switching of sides, and that would be the case with informal religion, but popular religion isn't so neatly defined, and these texts kind of come out of that blurring of boundaries. And you do need to bear in mind that these texts were catalogued and compiled by Christians, so they clearly had no problem keeping these things written down and probably using them as well. So how did the medical remedies actually work? Well, it does depend on the remedy and the prescription, but some of the remedies work based on the properties of the plants involved, which we're going to go into in a minute. Others work more on the principle of sympathetic magic, which I'm also going to elaborate on further, and others involve a degree of psychology through the holistic process that's followed. Now, Spearing does caution us that not once within the text does anyone use the words magic, spell or charm. They only mention such words if the remedy is actually intended to cure the effects of any of these three things. So the practitioners themselves actually understood these to be cures rather than magic, which kind of then puts them in the realm of medical practice, not magical practice. So it is really worth bearing these in mind before we dismiss them out of hand. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is the power of plants, and I think anyone who's listened to this podcast for any length of time will know that plants are one of my favourite topics. And the Lacnunga actually contains an invocation called the 9 Herbs Prayer, and SES Eberly theorises that it may have been used to help practitioners time their preparations. So for however long it took you to say something was however long you did something to one of the plants. It does contain 9 plants, including mugwort, plantain, shepherd's purse, nettle, betony, chamomile, crabapple, chervil and fennel. Obviously they're not the words that it actually uses, but that's the modern day names for these plants. And the plants were essentially boiled up, mixed with soap and then made into a salve to treat skin infections. Now, concoctions like this essentially worked due to the medicinal properties of the ingredients, And Julian Walker notes the huge importance of herbs to medicine in the period, and it is sometimes hard to work out which plants they actually refer to because the names have changed so much over the centuries. But he does point out that Leech Book 3 contains remedies that only use plants native to Britain, which again, rather than the Mediterranean ones, which sometimes include plants that just don't grow in our climate or we don't really have easy access to, the English ones or the British ones really do kind of hint at this British practice that dates back like 1,000 years at least. And it does show that there is this practice particular to the Anglo-Saxons, irrespective of the classical traditions of medicine. But ironically, these remedies also have contemporary versions, and Walker notes a recipe in the Leech Book for an ointment that would treat muscular pain that contains nettles, and you can actually buy similar ointments now. And likewise, we opened the episode with the idea that you could bind plantain around the head of a migraine sufferer with red thread. That might sound surprising, and in particular, the red thread is a Celtic idea that acts to protect the sufferer from the spirits that caused the headache in the first place. And if, like me, you get migraines, you can absolutely believe that there is somebody causing you pain. However, plantain is also an anti-inflammatory, so who's to say that the remedy didn't actually work by reducing inflammation in the area, but it just worked in a different way than they believed it did. And beyond that, and this is the thing that for me really grasps the attention about the Leech Books, students at Nottingham University actually recreated one of the salves in 2015, and it contained, among other things, cow bile, garlic, onion and leek. And they really weren't expecting it to actually work, but it turns out that not only did it work, it was actually a really powerful antibiotic, and it's so potent it can consistently kill the MRSA superbug. So it's nice to know that these remedies don't just work, they're actually incredible. Well, some of them anyway are incredibly effective. I dare say some of them possibly don't work, but that one in particular is worth paying attention to. So why did I say earlier that they also use psychology as well? Well, they did use a rudimentary grasp of psychology, even if the healers didn't fully understand what it was that they were doing, because these concoctions are often accompanied by charms or invocations. So, for example, when using the 9 herbs prayer, healers would sing the charm 3 times over each of the herbs during preparation. And then someone would sing the charm into the injured person's mouth, ears and then the wound before application. So why would you do this? Because singing is something you wouldn't imagine it would necessarily have much of an effect. Well, partly the rituals involve the use of numbers, and obviously we looked at the power of numbers in folklore a couple of episodes ago, but they also provide a sense of theatre. And this allows the healers to create like a special space for the patient, and songs, rhymes or charms would characterise these spaces, so they set the stage for the healing that was about to occur. And the placebo effect has been well documented, so if you believe a cure will work, it has a greater chance of doing so. Obviously it does depend on what the ailment is, but there is definitely a lot to the placebo effect. And while it's unlikely the early medieval healers were actually masters of psychology, they did understand enough to spot this mind-body connection. So as an example, Sinead Spearing gives the example of a remedy for an adder's bite, and you were to repeat the charm, Omnis malas bestias canto, which translates as I charm and overcome all evil wild beasts, 3 times before you cut elder from the plant. And elder ends up in so many remedies because it is such a useful plant. But then you were to visualise the person that you were trying to cure while you cut the elder into 3 pieces. You were then to turn away from the plant and not look back at it, and pound the cuttings into a paste. And if you applied this to the bite, the person would then recover. Now, it is unlikely that elder actually had an effect on adder venom, but it does ease inflammation or swelling, so it might have provided some local relief around the bite. But the very fact that someone had produced a remedy and focused on the idea of healing could produce the placebo effect required to make the cure work within the patient. And this is where we're going to move on to sympathetic magic, because it kind of all feeds into one another. And there is a principle that has taken root in popular culture that like attracts like, and you may have come across it within the law of attraction, despite the fact that law of attraction is essentially Hermetic philosophy repackaged for the Instagram age. If you're interested in Hermetic philosophy, I do touch on it briefly in the episode about alchemy that was sort of like sometime last year. But all of this originally comes from the idea of sympathetic magic. So if you do something to an object, it then has a knock-on effect on whatever the object represents. And one of the charms in the Lac Nunga is to alleviate a stitch. And you know how painful they are. It's really unpleasant. But the healer should boil feverfew, red nettles and plantain, so there it is again, another anti-inflammatory, in butter. And they should then speak another invocation, which is a bit longer, and dip a knife into the liquid. Now, the instructions don't explain necessarily why this should be done, so we are going to have to guess. But a stitch feels like a sudden stabbing pain, so if you soothe the stabbing implement, in this case putting the knife in the butter, then you're actually soothing the stitch. So you're essentially drawing the pain of the stitch into the knife. And Benjamin Slade also points out that all three of the plants, and here's the use of the number 3 again, which was also in the numbers episode, they are all sort of vaguely spear-shaped, so the logic runs as follows. You use a spear-shaped leaf to cure a complaint that feels like stabbing. And this is essentially how sympathetic healing works. You also get several remedies which are about getting rid of boils, and it's often about shrinking something else that then represents the boil or the cyst or whatever it is. And it's a bit like the old remedy that you may have heard about, the idea of if you want to get rid of a wart, if you push a pin into it and then push the pin into an ash tree, the wart should then disappear because you've essentially transferred it from one thing to another. And also, the Leech Book 3 includes a remedy for swollen eyes. And this is a really quite disgusting one, and it involves removing the eyes of a raven before it's dead and placing them onto the neck of the sufferer. And here, the body is believed to absorb the good eyesight of the raven. Now, incidentally, spearing does note that a major artery actually leads from the back of the neck to the eyes, and it's unlikely that folk healers knew about the artery, but they may have noted the link between eye complaints and the neck. And if you think about the number of times you end up with eye strain and you've got a crick in your neck at the same time, you'll no doubt have experienced this yourself. But the cure is believed to work through the transfer of power from one thing to another. So again, it's this idea that something works for a scientific reason, but then you think it works for a different reason entirely. Nowadays, of course, we know that viruses and bacteria cause many illnesses, and obviously at the moment we have ample proof of this. And venom or toxins do cause other ailments as well, so it is worth putting those in, that some of the things that you might use a remedy for are actually caused by things like nettles, for example. It's not actually a virus or a bacteria, it's the toxin in the plant. And the discovery of bacteria in 1676 did seem to hasten the end of a waning belief in elves. So by this point, people had already started to move away from the idea of the other world and away from the idea of elves. Although it would take until the 19th century and the work of Louis Pasteur around germ theory before the true causes of many complaints really became known. But we do have to pay attention to the fact that some of the Old English remedies no doubt continued to work, and just look at the MRSA cure as an example of that. Now, Nicholas Culpeper had already produced his complete herbal in 1653, which did help to make medical knowledge more accessible to ordinary people. And it does mean as well that after the dissolution of the monasteries, healthcare sort of moved out of the realm of the monks and then into the hands of other practitioners. And it doesn't mean that medicine still has all the answers, and I'm sure you, like me, have been to the doctors and they haven't had a clue what's wrong with you, and you either get told that you just need a diet, you need to exercise, or you need to meditate more. I'm sure you've all been there as well. But I do like the idea that in this Old English period, when you might think of it as the Dark Ages, that there is actually still some wisdom contained in these texts, which both show that there was an indigenous to Britain magical practice, but also a medicinal practice as well. And I do think that this commingling between Old English remedies for the Anglo-Saxons and then also the Christian ideas as well, I do think that that needs more attention in the wider world. I should point out, as we're just wrapping up now, please don't go out and try any of these remedies for yourself. Obviously, I'm just repeating abridged versions of them, and none of the advice that I might give in this particular episode is intended as a cure. Please go and see a doctor if there's anything wrong with you. So that's my disclaimer. Don't try this at home, essentially. Now, I am fascinated to know what you think of any of these remedies, and if you've tried anything similar yourself which does work. I mean, we've all heard of things like peppermint tea to cure an upset stomach, or lemon and ginger tea, for example, is really good for sore throats, and so on. Manuka honey in particular is obviously excellent because it does have antibacterial properties to it. So if you do have any medicinal remedies that you really think work particularly well, if you want to sort of drop me a line and let me know, I might actually collect some of them together, and obviously that's what would be cool to get your testimony that they do actually work. That would be really cool. And as I said at the start of this episode, next week we will be having a look at dentistry and teeth. So if you are squeamish about that at all, maybe listen anyway, because we will be meeting the Tooth Fairy and she is quite interesting. So I will try and keep the gory bits to a minimum, but I mean, I'm probably freaked out by teeth and stuff anyway, so I just wanted to put that warning in. But then we will have a look at plague folklore after that. So please let me know if you'd rather have the Doctrine of Signatures or Sleep for the final episode in August. And then after that, we are going to go on to mythological creatures for September. And I do also have things planned out for October as well. But if you do have any requests, as always, please do let me know, because I do have a list that I am working my way through. I am also going to be writing the Patreon exclusive episode next week, which is going to be on the Cock Lane ghost, which is quite fascinating as it sort of gives rise to a lot of really interesting things in the realm of the ghost story. So if you want to get access to that, then you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon for $4 a month. And then you also get these episodes. You get the blog posts that these episodes are based on in PDF format as well. So I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead. If it's hot where you are, please do try to stay cool. And I will see you soon. Cheerio. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to subscribe using whichever podcast app it is that you prefer. If you do use iTunes, if you could leave me a review, that would be fab. Basically, it just means iTunes are more likely to recommend this to other people. And if you're interested in more folklore, please feel free to swing by my blog, which is www.icsedgwick.com, and that's Sedgwick spelled Sedgwick. And you can find all of the links, images and other bits and pieces that hopefully you enjoy. So have an absolutely fab week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio.